Like myself, you missed out on the opportunity to serve during the Falkland War. I guess having a heavily pregnant wife at home would have been far from ideal, but weren't you a bit disappointed?
In a way, yes, Nick. I used to wake up every morning, listen to the news about what had happened in the Falklands and think, I should be down there. But then I'd think, this is not a good time family-wise. So it's always a trade-off. And to be honest, by then I was in Germany, of course. It was one squadron at Wittering, my old squadron that were down in the South Atlantic. And we just sent a few reinforcement pilots to go and help out the Navy and one squadron as well. And yes, I was very suitably qualified with my one squadron time. And in some ways I should have gone down, but as I subsequently found out, my squadron commander had blocked my going down anyway. So.
I think he's a fine chap, and I'm sure your wife would agree. You mentioned a little tension between the Navy and the RAF pilots serving aboard the carriers that I wasn't aware of. Do you think you could expand on that a little without embarrassing yourself?
I won't embarrass myself. I may say something that might annoy a few other people. I think people need to read Pete Squire on this. Air Chief Marshal Sir Peter Squire, who's now dead sadly, wrote very well about this in the Harrier Boys Volume 1 about the South Atlantic and Operation Corporate. He gives a very clear and very candid view of his view, a very candid view of what went on in the South Atlantic, particularly with respect to the interrelationship between air and the ship drivers on the carriers, whereas the Navy seemed to have a view about how they would operate aircraft which didn't go hand in glove with the Royal Air Force's way, and it seemed rather as though air became very secondary to what the ship was doing, and I think that caused a lot of angst and a lot of difficulty. And I think it's very unfortunate because it should have been a much more cohesive operation, and I think from that we probably learnt a lot as well, and we moved on from that, and things now are much more cohesive between the three services.
Yeah. You mentioned you led a deployment out to the Falklands after the war, and you mentioned that you felt the need to, I found it quite amusing, restrict your pilots from watching videos during the day when they were otherwise occupied. For my many hours spent whiling away the time on QRA.
Yes.
I remember the video machine being a godsend. I'm curious why you wanted to lay down those restrictions when perhaps other detachments didn't.
Okay. I think the air defence world, which you're alluding to, obviously, is different because they had a QRA requirement 24 hours a day. We didn't. Okay. So that in the evening, we could switch off and just say the phantoms at the other end of the airfield are looking after Q. So we're off the hook. So we could get together. And I think part of being on detachment is that you actually try and build some spirit and some morale, because you're 8,000 miles away from home. It can get difficult, and if people form little cliques and start doing their own thing, it can be quite corrosive, especially in a small operation like the Harrier flight, because when we're talking about the officers, I would have like 7 pilots down there. I would have an army major, a ground liaison officer, I'd have 1 engineering officer, and that would be it. So there'd be about 9 officers. Now, you don't really want cliques appearing here, and I don't want to get into what's happening with the Red Arrows at the moment, but you actually want to keep the guys together and do some team building. And I think if you're there for 3 months, the least you can do is actually, if you want to watch a film, we'll all watch a film together. What are we going to watch, guys? Let's have a beer, watch a film together, and it's a social occasion. And what you don't want is somebody deciding they're going to watch a film. A couple of guys sit down at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, start watching a film, and then other guys want to watch one at 6:30, but they're watching and they're halfway through, and then you say, oh, well, So I discussed it with the guys, and we said, right, no, what we'll do is we'll all have tea, then we'll all get together, we'll have a film every evening at 7 o'clock. And it's a sort of team building thing.
Sure.
And if you allow people to just watch films during the day, and again, I'm not having a swipe at the Q guys, because, they've got time to kill and they need to entertain themselves. But if you've got a job to do during the day, and we were flying, but we also had other things to do, if you allow people just to laze around in a crew room all day, they will just watch films and while away their time and do nothing useful.
Yeah, yeah.
As you well know.
We would, yeah, absolutely. Now, losing a Harrier during your short time in the Falklands must have been a blow. What did the Board of Inquiry have to say about that?
Well, I lost two actually because I was in the Falklands twice, and both times I lost aircraft. The first one was Mark Leakey, who's my number 2, and that was a straightforward engine failure. Off the top of my head, I can't honestly remember what the cause of that was, but it was one of those Harrier engine failures, probably similar to mine. It may well have been FOD, but for a fact I can't remember at the moment. The more interesting aspect of that accident was that Mark had a lot of trouble getting into his dinghy. Now, we used to do a lot of training for this every year about finishing up in the water, how to get into your dinghy and all that sort of thing. And of course, the preaching was if the parachute came down over the top of you, then you just found a seam, worked your way along the seam to get out from underneath the parachute.
I remember
and
it
then
well.
get into your dinghy. You know, we were all told that's what you do. That's exactly what happened to Mark, because it was absolutely still. There was no wind at all. He finished up in the water with the parachute coming down right on the top of him. He worked his way along, got himself out from underneath the parachute canopy, by which time his legs were all caught up in the rigging lines. And then he couldn't get into the dinghy because his legs were all caught up and he had the weight and he couldn't manoeuvre his legs and all that sort of thing. So he finished up half in and half out of his dinghy, completely exhausted. Now, it wouldn't have been too bad if the helicopter had come, because the helicopter was only based about a mile from where he landed. But unfortunately, the helicopter was being worked on at the time, because though we'd started flying, nobody had told them. So the helicopter was in pieces that was supposed to be on standby for our flying operations. We launched, and by the time Mark ejected, which was like only 10 minutes after we'd launched, after we'd done the weather check, the aircraft still wasn't able to fly. So they had finished up hurriedly putting it back together again, eventually got airborne, came out, found Mark, cut him free of his rigging lines, and got him in the helicopter and flew him away.
Had he become hypothermic?
No, I don't think so. He hadn't been in the water that long, and of course he'd got an immersion suit on, he got all the right underclothes on and everything, so I think he was okay. He was just very, very tired at that point.
Interesting, yeah. You don't mention the Phantom chaps who were also in the Falklands match. Did you guys mix at all?
Well, professionally or socially? Or
socially,
both?
Yeah.
Socially,
well,
yeah.
Actually both, yeah.
That's a very good point, actually, Nick. We didn't mix socially that much. We worked with them quite closely every day. You know, we do flying operations, which would involve them. Socially, we didn't mix that much, as I remember.
Interesting. Because there weren't very many pilots on the whole place, and you're the only two fighters out there.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Looking back on it, I think perhaps they were doing this queue bit, so they were spending a lot of time on queue, and when they weren't on queue, they were down. They had downtime to recover and do whatever they did, and so on. What I do remember, certainly from my first detachment or second detachment, I must say, we actually got on very well with the Bristow's helicopter guys, and we used to do quite a lot of socialising with them. And they had a house in town where they all lived, and they used to have an open evening. I think it was every Wednesday night, so we used to go and socialise with those guys. So Phantom guys, not particularly, to be honest. And I can't think of any particular reason for that. It just didn't seem to happen. You just don't
like Phantom pilots, I can tell.
I wouldn't say that. But when we were down at the Coastal, which is where we lived, this floating hotel that was down there, you'd have a beer with the guys down there, but it wasn't like we actually had social events with them as such.
Interesting. You appeared to enjoy your return to the Falklands, but lost another Harrier, you've already mentioned, and nearly the pilot as well.
Yeah.
Was it just a coincidence, or were the accident rates there higher than in Germany?
It was just a coincidence. I don't think there was anything particular about it. The second accident was, again, an engine failure, but that was caused by a bird being taken down. The aircraft was travelling at very high speed and very low level at the time, just coming onto the airfield boundary, actually, on a simulated attack. So that's just a normal operating hazard. It goes back to your point about one engine or two engines. Unfortunately, that was a big bird and it did a lot of damage. And Ian Wilkes, the pilot, had no option but to get out of the aircraft very quickly.
Now, your return to Germany, of course, involved several field deployments, sometimes with much excitement, I read. Did you ever resent having to spend so much time under canvas, albeit with the occasional ice cream van visit?
It did become a bit of a pain, to be honest, yes. And you must also, I would also say that we carried on doing these field deployments while we were supporting the South Atlantic as well. So it was a very demanding time, and I think you can relate to this from your own time in the military, that when something crops up, like, albeit post the Falklands War, we're still supporting the Falklands effort down there, you're still doing your day job back at home, which is providing a presence in the central region to make sure that the Soviets are aware that we're still there and we're still fully trained. And so I think I did 3 field deployments every year that I was in Germany. They tended to be 2-week deployments. The winter one was only 1 week. We only put 1 field site out in the winter just to prove the concept. And I say that advisedly because it was pretty bloody miserable, to be honest. Every year I finished up commanding the field site that went out in the middle of winter. The temperature at night generally, and this is no exaggeration, we get down to -10, -14 degrees at night every year I went out. And we had our normal camping gear, 12 by 12 tents. The only thing we did was we took a second sleeping bag out with us. So we were on camp beds, you tended to be in 2 sleeping bags, but it was pretty blooming miserable, to be honest. But we could do it, we did it. It was not nice, but we proved that you could take the aircraft out into a bare base and operate in the middle of winter.
I'm now in my mind thinking poor sleeping patterns because of the conditions, operating in the field where flight safety problems must rear their ugly head, tired air crew. Was there any mitigation of those threats? No, we just did it. And that's the thing, you know, you're going to have an aircraft like the Harrier. It's not easy to operate it when you take it off base. And it's not just us, it's the engineers as well. They have to keep the thing serviceable. All the engineering was done in open air?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, my very last winter deployment on the Friday afternoon, we're all looking forward hugely to getting back to base that afternoon. One of the aircraft landed with an engine problem. And I think, in all honesty, it was probably picked up after the aircraft had landed. And it was an engine change, Friday afternoon. And no. And I'm the site commander. So I went, right, everybody else clear the site. And what they called the field repair team was called out from Gütersloh. So these are the guys who are on standby with another engine. And they come out to do major problems out in the field. So these guys were called out on a Friday afternoon. So we cleared the whole site. So all the other aircraft went. Most of the engineers went. We kept a few to help the field repair team. We had some rations. I don't think we kept the caterers behind, but we just kept the bare minimum of people. And then the field repair team came along, and they arrived late afternoon with another engine for this thing. And of course they then had the crane, they had to lift the wing off, take the engine out, engine back in, wing back on.
What a job.
They're all done in 8 hours.
Yeah. There's Friday afternoon motivation for you.
It was amazing. And, you know, so we were there sort of sitting around in the tent. We probably went for a beer, I can't really remember. But, you know, the field repair team, by early morning, had got the aircraft sorted out. They'd done a ground run. Everything was okay. And I was there to fly it out. I was the only pilot. I just stayed behind myself as site commander. And I was going to fly it out. A very interesting little follow-up to that, because when I went to fly the aircraft out the next day, there were 3 little switches down in the cockpit here. And I can't for the life of me remember what the 3 did, because we never touched them. They're nothing to do with the pilots at all. And one of them was to limit the RPM available for ground runs. And we always checked those whenever we got in, and they were quite important. So they were gate locked. So there was a bar over them and a screw in. So once they were locked, they weren't going to shake loose or anything like that. And as usual, I just climbed up, started doing my checks, went there, and one of those was switched off.
Oh, naughty.
And I switched it back on, screwed it in, and if I'd tried taking off, I would have had restricted RPM.
Oh.
I would only have got about 90% if I remember
That would
rightly.
not have been funny.
Wouldn't have been funny, no.
No.
Having said, I might have got away with it, but of course, what we did was on every field takeoff, you slammed to full power and you just glued on the RPM gauge while you're trying to keep straight as well. But you glued on the RPM gauge, and if there was any issue with the RPM just not going straight up to 100+%, you just slammed the throttle closed. So I think I probably got away with it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you don't really want to put yourself in that position to start with.
No.